August 18, 1944. At 22:10 hours, 320 feet below the surface of the South China Sea, Lieutenant Commander Henry Musson carefully adjusted the focus on the periscope, scanning the blackness with the aid of radar as a vast convoy drew steadily closer. 13 ships in total, the largest assembly of troop transports he had encountered in months. What Munson could not yet know was that his submarine, the USS Rasher, was about to unleash one of the most devastating nights in the history of Japanese naval transportation. A night so catastrophic it would send shockwaves through the entire Japanese maritime command structure, a night that would become synonymous with irreversible loss. On board the escort carrier Teo, Captain Shuichi Sugino stood on the bridge, eyes fixed on the horizon, a deep sense of unease growing within him. The convoy, designated High 71, carried 4,795 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, desperately needed reinforcements for the Philippine front. Since the beginning of 1944, such convoys had been hemorrhaging ships at an alarming rate. Vessels vanished beneath the waves with chilling consistency. The Americans referred to them as submarines. The Japanese had a far more chilling name, the Silent Death. What had started as isolated attacks in 1942 had, by 1944, evolved into a meticulously coordinated campaign of annihilation, one that would ultimately claim 55% of Japan's entire merchant fleet. By the war's end, over 5.3 million tons of shipping would be lost to the depths. But the true measure of the horror was not in numbers of tons or ships, but in the human cost: tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers perishing in the dark, trapped in the flooded holds of sinking vessels, as American torpedoes ripped through steel like paper. This is the story of how American submarines forged a reign of terror so profound that Japanese merchant sailors began refusing sea assignments. It is the story of how convoy commanders began falsifying routes to avoid known submarine-infested waters, how the unseen hunters beneath the waves dismantled not only Japan's logistical backbone, but also the very morale of an empire utterly dependent on the sea. The nightmare had begun on December 7, 1941, though not in the way most remember. While Japanese bombers ravaged Pearl Harbor, 29 American submarines of the Asiatic Fleet were already on station in Philippine waters. Within hours of the attack, Admiral Thomas Hart issued a directive that would define the Pacific Submarine War: execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. No warnings, no quarter. Every Japanese merchant ship, without exception, was now a legitimate target. But the American submarine force was far from ready. The Pacific Fleet at the time consisted of just 55 fleet submarines and 18 outdated SBOTs. Even worse, they were equipped with a weapon that failed to function as designed. The Mark 14 torpedo, once the pride of American ordnance, was fundamentally defective. Its magnetic exploder either detonated prematurely or failed to trigger at all. Its depth control ran nearly 11 feet deeper than set. Its contact exploder crumpled upon impact rather than detonating. For the first 18 months of the war, American submarines fired hundreds of torpedoes that struck Japanese hulls with solid, metallic thuds and did nothing. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage of the USS Trout recorded his frustration in December 1941. He had fired 4 torpedoes at a stationary Japanese transport from 1,500 yards. All 4 hit. All 4 made clear contact. None exploded. He watched, powerless, as the ship sailed away, unharmed. The sound of those silent, non-detonating impacts haunted submariners for years. They called it the sound of betrayal. In the early days of 1942, Japanese merchant officers sailed with a sense of confidence. Their military leadership assured them that American submarines posed little danger. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine, developed in the 1922nd and early 1930s, had been built around the idea that submarines would be used in fleet actions against warships, not in commerce raiding. Japan had never seriously prepared for a war against merchant shipping. At the start of the conflict, the Imperial Japanese Navy had allocated just 47 vessels for convoy escort duty. In contrast, Britain deployed over 400 escorts in the Atlantic. Japanese depth charges were set to explode at 60 feet. American submarines routinely operated at 300 feet or deeper. Captain Tamichihara of the destroyer Shigure later wrote, "We treated submarine defense as an afterthought, a task for obsolete ships and inexperienced crews. The elite destroyer forces were reserved for fleet actions against American carriers and battleships. Protecting merchant ships was seen as unworthy of true samurai warriors." This dismissive attitude toward defensive naval operations would prove fatal. By mid-1943, American submarines had overcome their torpedo problems, thanks to the bold, often unauthorized actions of commanders who conducted their own field tests. Admiral Charles Lockwood proved the Mark 14 ran too deep by firing torpedoes at fishing nets, suspended at known depths. The weapons passed cleanly underneath. Other submarine captains tested the contact exploders by firing at Hawaiian sea cliffs. The torpedoes struck the rock face and failed to detonate, only exploding later when they tumbled into deep water and were triggered by water pressure. Once these flaws were corrected, American submarines transformed into the most lethal commerce raiders the world had ever seen. The math of destruction became overwhelming. In 1942, American submarines sank about 180 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 725,000 tons, but torpedo shortages and cautious leadership limited their effectiveness. As more aggressive commanders replaced hesitant ones, as code-breaking provided precise convoy routes, and as new shipyards delivered 40 submarines per year, the campaign intensified beyond Japan's ability to respond. On board the cargo ship Tatsutamaru on February 8, 1943, Executive Officer Yoshio Nakamura penned his final diary entry, "Radar Contact, American Submarine." The diary was found decades later, washed ashore near Yokohama. The USS Tarpon had fired 4 torpedoes. All 4 hit. The Tatsutamaru sank in just 90 seconds so quickly that 943 passengers and crew had no chance to reach lifeboats. The ship, once a proud luxury liner of the Nippon Yusen Kaisha Line, which had carried tourists between San Francisco and Tokyo for 12 years, simply disappeared beneath the waves. Nakamura's watch stopped at 3:47. The sinking of the Tatsutamaru marked a turning point in the psychology of the Japanese merchant marine. Officers who once sailed with confidence now requested transfers to shore duty. Crews began demanding double pay for voyages through the Luzon Strait, a stretch of sea now known to Japanese sailors as Torpedo Alley. The Japanese merchant fleet, which required 6 million tons of active shipping to sustain the empire's war economy and supply lines, was losing ships faster than shipyards could replace them. Warrant Officer Kazuo Sakamoto, a convoy escort commander aboard the destroyer Hamakaze, filed a classified report in April 1943, later captured by American forces, that laid bare the dire situation. American submarines operate with intelligence, suggesting they know our routes in advance. They position themselves at choke points, attack at night on the surface using radar we cannot detect, and vanish before our escorts can respond. Our depth charges cannot reach them when they dive deep. Our sonar cannot track them through thermal layers. We are fighting an enemy we cannot see and cannot harm. The Americans had indeed broken Japanese naval codes. Operation Magic gave submarine commanders access to convoy routes, schedules, and sometimes even cargo manifests. Combined with ultra-intelligence from the Japanese Merchant Shipping Code, American submarines knew exactly where to be and when. It was no longer warfare, it was a scheduled execution. By mid-1943, the number of American submarines in the Pacific had surged from 55 to 104. Each submarine conducted about 5 patrols per year, each lasting roughly 60 days. With 100 submarines operating simultaneously, Japanese merchant ships faced a continuous gauntlet of steel, stretching from the home islands to Singapore, from the Philippines to New Guinea. Every major shipping lane was under surveillance. Every key harbor was watched. Convoys that sailed on predictable schedules to known destinations became floating coffins for thousands. The summer of 1943 brought fresh horror to Japanese merchant sailors. On July 23, the transport Montado Maru, carrying over 1,000 Australian prisoners of war and civilians, was torpedoed by the USS Sturgeon off the Philippines. The ship sank in 11 minutes. There were no survivors among the prisoners, though Japanese crew members managed to abandon ship. The incident would later be recognized as Australia's worst maritime disaster, though it remained unknown for years. American submarines had no way of distinguishing prisoner transports from troop transports. Lieutenant Tishi Nakao, a Japanese escort officer aboard the destroyer Urakazi, kept a private journal that survived the war. In August 1943, he wrote, "Lost 3 ships this week to American submarines. The convoys are becoming suicide missions. Merchant captains argue with my orders, demanding longer routes to avoid known submarine zones. I cannot blame them." Last month, we lost 7 transports in the Makassar Strait. The Americans are everywhere and nowhere. We glimpse their periscopes for seconds before torpedoes strike. By the time we prepare depth charges, they are gone. Our escorts drop charges into empty water, while men drown because we cannot stop to rescue them. The death toll was not limited to sailors and soldiers. Japanese transports carried hundreds of thousands of forced laborers called romusha, conscripted from occupied territories. When ships sank, these laborers, locked in cargo holds, drowned without any hope of escape. Allied prisoners of war were also transported on unmarked vessels, later known as hell ships. When American submarines torpedoed these ships, thousands of Allied prisoners perished. Estimates suggest that approximately 10,800 Allied prisoners of war died in submarine attacks during the Pacific War. The Americans had no way of knowing prisoners were on board. Japanese ships were not marked according to Geneva Convention rules. By January 1944, Japan's shipping situation had reached a crisis point. The empire required 5.9 million tons of merchant shipping to sustain both its domestic economy and military operations. The actual available tonnage had plummeted to 4.1 million tons. New construction could not keep pace with losses. January saw 112,000 tons sunk. February, 217,000 tons. March, 167,000 tons. In March 1944, a document titled Analysis of Convoy Defense Failures was circulated among Japanese merchant marine officers, later captured by American intelligence, in Manila. It laid out the grim reality. American submarines attack at night using surface radar, a capability our escorts lack. They coordinate in wolf packs, a tactic we believed only the Germans could master. They have reliable torpedoes that explode on contact, unlike our Type 93, which often fails. Most critically, they receive intelligence on our convoy routes from unknown sources, allowing them to position themselves in advance. Defensive measures have failed. Increasing escort numbers has not reduced losses. Changing routes only reveals new submarine patrol zones. The American submarine force is too large, too skilled, and too well informed for our countermeasures to succeed. Captain Yasu, writing in his diary in April 1944, lamented, "We are losing this war one transport at a time. The Army demands reinforcements for the Philippines, for New Guinea, for the Marianas. Every convoy we send loses ships." Last week, the Taichi convoy lost 4 transports to submarine attacks, killing over 4,000 soldiers. These were veteran troops from China, impossible to replace. The Americans do not need to invade if they can starve our garrisons and sink our reinforcements. The Taichi convoy disaster of April 1944 revealed the full extent of American submarine dominance. The convoy carried the 32nd Division bound for Mindanao and the 35th Division bound for Western New Guinea. On April 26, the USS Jack torpedoed the Yoshida Maru, killing 1,544 soldiers. On May 6, the USS Gurnard sank the Aden Maru, killing 350 troops. Later that same day, the USS Angler torpedoed the Tai Maru, killing 600. Finally, the USS Gurnard returned to sink the Tenshin Maru, killing 1,500 soldiers. The surviving ships diverted to Halmahera, where the shattered divisions were unloaded far from their intended destinations. Days later, Douglas MacArthur's forces invaded Hollandia, bypassing the very positions these divisions were meant to defend. The failure of the Taichi convoy forced Japanese imperial headquarters to concede that Western New Guinea could no longer be reinforced or held. But nothing could prepare the Japanese for the night of August 18, 1944. When convoy HI-71 sailed directly into the crosshairs of an American submarine wolfpack. Commander Henry Empson aboard the USS Russia had been tracking the convoy since the afternoon. when his radar operator detected 9 separate aircraft patrols to the north. Large air coverage meant a high-value target. As darkness fell and a heavy storm moved in, Empson maneuvered the Rasher into position. At 22:10 hours, he fired 2 stern torpedoes at the tanker Teo Maru. Both struck. The vessel, loaded with gasoline, erupted in a fireball 300 meters high. Debris scattered 150 meters from the burning wreck. The escorts fired blindly, dropping depth charges far behind the Rasher's position. At 23:10, Empson fired 6 bow torpedoes at the largest ship in the convoy. 3 struck the Teo Maru, a 17,537-ton former French ocean liner. On board, 4,795 Japanese soldiers and 427 civilians were settling in for the night when the torpedoes hit. The ship began to sink immediately. Panic erupted in the darkened holds as water surged in. Men scrambled for ladders, fighting to reach the deck. Most never made it. The Teo Maru sank in about 4 minutes. When rescue ships arrived days later, they found only 2,100 survivors floating in the storm-tossed waters. A total of 2,665 people had perished. On the escort carrier Teo, Captain Kimura ordered his aircraft to search for the attacker. Before they could launch, the USS Redfish fired 4 torpedoes. 2 hit. The Teo's aviation fuel ignited, flames spreading through the hangar deck. The carrier sank at approximately 22:30, taking 850 crew members with her. Shortly after midnight, the Rasher fired 4 more torpedoes at the cargo transport Ain Maru. 3 struck. The ship was carrying ammunition. The resulting explosion sent a pressure wave across the Rasher's bridge, 2,000 meters away, stunning the crew. Empson swung the Rasher hard to the right and fired 2 stern torpedoes at the armed merchant cruiser Noshiro Maru. Both hit. The ship slowed to 5 knots, then began to sink. At 3:33 hours, the USS Spadefish, under Lieutenant Commander Gordon Underwood, fired 6 torpedoes at the landing craft depot ship Tamatsu Maru. 2 struck. The massive 460-foot vessel rolled over and sank within minutes. 4,755 troops and 135 merchant sailors went down with the ship. That afternoon, rescue ships found the debris field of the Tamatsu Maru. About 2,000 bodies floated in the water. The heavy seas from the typhoon that had scattered the convoy made effective rescue impossible. Most survivors in the water drowned in the following hours, unable to be reached. In less than 5 hours, convoy HI-71 had been obliterated. 7 ships sunk or crippled. Over 8,500 Japanese personnel killed. Not a single American casualty. The submarines withdrew undamaged, except for minor hull fractures on the Spadefish from a distant depth charge explosion. The psychological impact of HI-71's destruction rippled through the entire Japanese merchant marine and naval command. Rear Admiral Suto Musato, who would later command convoy HI-81, wrote in a confidential report, "The Americans have perfected submarine warfare to a degree we cannot match. They attack in coordinated groups, using radar to track us while remaining invisible. They fire accurate torpedoes from positions we cannot detect. Our escorts are helpless. We drop depth charges at random, hoping for lucky hits. The submarines dive deep beneath our charges and escape. Meanwhile, thousands of soldiers drown. This cannot continue. We need radar. We need better sonar. We need more escorts, and we need them now. Without these tools, every convoy is a massacre waiting to happen." Japan had none of these. Destroyer production consumed resources needed for aircraft and tanks. The best destroyers were assigned to fleet actions against American carriers. Only outdated destroyers and converted civilian ships served as escorts. Japanese radar development lagged American technology by 3 to 4 years. The first shipboard radar units did not appear until late 1943, and installation was slow. Meanwhile, by mid-1943, every American submarine carried multiple radar systems for surface search and aircraft warning. Captain Kazushige Matsumura, a merchant marine officer who survived the sinking of the Nitaran Maru in September 1944, later recalled the terror in post-war interviews. "We knew the Americans were waiting. The question wasn't if we'd be attacked, but when." Sailing through the Luzon Strait at night, every man was awake, staring into the dark. listening for the sound we all dreaded, the churning wake of incoming torpedoes. When you heard that sound, you had maybe 20 seconds to decide whether to jump or run for the lifeboats. Usually, there was no time for either. The torpedo struck, the ship shuddered, water rushed in. If you were below decks, you drowned. If you were on deck, you might survive, but only if the ship sank slowly enough for lifeboats to launch. Most sank in minutes. The Americans used torpedo patterns that ensured multiple hits. We called them the silent death because you never saw them. Just the sound of the torpedoes, then the explosion, then screaming, then darkness. By late 1944, the situation had deteriorated beyond all expectations. In November 1944, Convoy HI-81 attempted to transport the 23rd Division from Manchuria to the Philippines. It included escort carriers Shinyu and Akitsu Maru, the destroyer Kashi, multiple escorts, and 3 landing craft depot ships, Shinshu Maru, Kibitsu Maru, and Mayasan Maru, carrying 4,500 soldiers. On November 17th, the USS Queenfish fired 4 torpedoes at Akitsu Maru. 3 hit. The ship sank in 3 minutes. 2,150 men died, mostly soldiers of the 23rd Division trapped below. Hours later, the USS Pikuda torpedoed Mayasan Maru. The ship exploded and sank, killing 3,437. The next night, the USS Spadefish returned, torpedoing the escort carrier Shinyo. 4 torpedoes hit. The carrier caught fire and sank, taking 1,130 sailors with her. Submarine chaser No. 156 was also destroyed. All hands lost. Over 4 days, HI-81 lost 4 major vessels and nearly 7,000 lives. The convoy turned back to Shanghai, regrouped with new escorts, and split into 2 groups. One reached Manila on December 2nd, the other reached Singapore on December 4th. But the 23rd Division arrived without most of its heavy weapons, artillery, and supplies, forced to fight as light infantry. Japanese military leadership could no longer deny the effectiveness of American submarines. In December 1944, Army General Yoshiro Umezu submitted a report to the Imperial War Council. Submarine attacks have rendered seaborne reinforcement of our defensive positions impossible. The Philippines cannot be adequately reinforced. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies cannot supply the homeland because tankers are sunk faster than they can be replaced. Strategic raw materials from Southeast Asia pile up in warehouses because ships no longer arrive. The American submarine campaign has strangled our war economy. Without imported oil, our aircraft cannot fly, our warships cannot sail, our industries cannot produce. We are being defeated, not by superior force, but by superior strategy. The numbers confirmed this bleak assessment. Japan began the war with 6.4 million tons of merchant shipping. By the end of 1944, only 2.1 million tons remained operational. New construction added 3.9 million tons during the war, but losses exceeded 8.9 million tons by war's end. American submarines accounted for 55% of those losses. Carrier aircraft and mines accounted for most of the rest. By early 1945, Japan's merchant fleet was effectively destroyed. Shipping capacity fell below the 2 million tons needed to feed the population. Starvation loomed. By summer 1945, the human toll was staggering. Conservative estimates place the number of Japanese soldiers killed in transport sinkings at 97,342 more than the total American combat deaths inflicted by the Marine Corps and Army in the Central Pacific from Tarawa to Iwo Jima. Tens of thousands of merchant sailors, civilian workers, and forced laborers also perished. The true total may exceed 150,000 deaths directly caused by submarine warfare. For Japanese sailors and soldiers ordered onto transports, the voyage became a death sentence. Survivors reported lifelong nightmares, the sound of torpedoes striking steel, the screams of men trapped as compartments flooded, the darkness and chaos of capsizing ships, the hours floating in oil-slicked water, waiting for rescue that never came. These memories haunted them forever. Ensign Haruki Ito, who survived the Mayasan Maru by clinging to debris for 18 hours, described it in 1978. The torpedo hit sounded like a massive hammer, striking an iron plate. The ship lurched violently. Men fell down ladders, crushing those below. Water rushed into the hold. The emergency lights failed immediately. In total darkness, thousands tried to reach the deck. Most couldn't find the ladders. Those who did found them blocked by panicked soldiers. The ship rolled and began to sink. I was on deck when it happened that saved my life. I jumped and swam away. The ship sank in about 2 minutes. The suction pulled men under. I heard them scream, then silence. I floated for 18 hours before a patrol boat found me. Of 4,500 men aboard, fewer than 700 survived. Every time I close my eyes, I see the ship going down and hear the screaming. It never stops. By early 1945, American submarines faced a new problem. There were no targets left. The Japanese merchant fleet had been so thoroughly destroyed that submarines returned from patrols having never fired a torpedo. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey of the USS Barb began shelling trains and coastal factories with his deck gun. Commander Lawson Ramage of the USS Pintado requested reassignment, saying submarine warfare had become obsolete due to lack of targets. The strategic impact of the campaign exceeded all pre-war predictions. Japan's war economy collapsed not because factories were bombed, but because raw materials could not reach them. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies were sunk before reaching home. Rubber, tin, and other resources piled up in Southeast Asian ports, undeliverable. Food from Korea and Manchuria could not be brought safely to Japan. By March 1945, oil stockpiles were nearly gone. The combined fleet could not sortie for lack of fuel. Aircraft sat grounded. Training flights were cancelled. The once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy, reduced to a handful of operational ships, remained in port, unable to leave. In April 1945, the USS Tang, under Lieutenant Commander George Street, sank 4 vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin, one of the last major submarine actions of the war, but by then, meaningful Japanese merchant shipping had ceased to exist. The war against commerce was over. The submarines had won. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the remaining merchant fleet totaled 1.5 million tons, mostly damaged or barely operational. Of the original 6.4 million tons in 1941, plus 3.9 million tons built during the war, 8.8 million tons had been lost. The Japanese merchant fleet had been annihilated more completely than any in history. American submarine losses totaled 52 boats and 3,563 men, a 22% casualty rate, the highest of any U.S. military branch. But the exchange ratio was devastating. For every American submarine lost, Japan lost approximately 170,000 tons of shipping and thousands of lives. No campaign in history achieved such strategic results with such a small force. 288 American submarines, less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's tonnage, strangled an empire. The success stemmed from multiple interlocking advantages: technological superiority, radar, sonar, and reliable torpedoes; intelligence, dominance, code-breaking that revealed convoy routes in advance; tactical innovation, wolfpack coordination; operational ruthlessness, unrestricted warfare from day one; industrial capacity, 228 submarines built during the war; and crew quality, volunteer, highly trained, and motivated submariners. For Japanese survivors, the trauma endured. In a 1987 reunion in Tokyo, veterans shared stories of nightmares that had lasted decades. Former Captain Tishi Yamada, who survived 3 submarine attacks, said, "I am 82. The war ended 42 years ago, but every night, I dream of submarines. I see the periscope break the surface. I hear the torpedo launch. I try to turn the ship, but I move in slow motion. The torpedoes hit. The ship shudders. Men scream. Then I wake up. For 42 years. The same dream. The Americans were ghosts. We never saw them, except for a brief glimpse of a periscope. But they were everywhere, always watching, always waiting. We lived in terror of the silent death." The strategic implications extended far beyond tonnage. Submarines forced Japan into inefficient convoy systems. Ships idled for days. Zigzag routes added time. Slower speeds reduced trips. Even surviving ships saw a 60% reduction in effective capacity. Submarines diverted Japanese resources from offense to defense. Destroyers that could have escorted carriers instead guarded merchants. Aircraft that could have bombed American bases instead patrolled for subs. The psychological burden of defending against an invisible, unpredictable enemy consumed Japanese military planning. Most importantly, submarine warfare made Japanese defensive strategy impossible. Operation Show, the plan to defend the Philippines, relied on massive reinforcements. American submarines prevented them. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was fought with Japanese forces in the Philippines, severely under strength. General MacArthur's island-hopping campaign succeeded because garrisons were isolated and undersupplied, cut off by submarines. The strategic bombing campaign worked because Japanese fighters lacked fuel tankers sunk by submarines. The American submarine campaign against Japan remains the most successful commerce destruction operation in naval history. Unlike German U-boats, which sank 14 million tons but failed to strangle Britain, or Japanese submarines, which focused on warships and sank only 1 million tons of Allied shipping, American submarines completely destroyed an enemy's merchant fleet and crippled its war economy through sea denial alone. The legacy endures. The US Navy made nuclear submarines the core of Cold War strategy. The Soviet Union built the world's largest submarine fleet, inspired by American Pacific operations. Modern naval doctrine assumes submarines will dominate future commerce warfare. For Japan, the trauma-shaped post-war policy. The Maritime Self-Defense Force prioritized anti-submarine warfare. Japanese sonar and ASW technology became world-leading. In 1995, a memorial in Tokyo honored 60,000 merchant mariners who died most in submarine attacks. The inscription reads, "They sailed into danger, knowing death awaited them. They served their nation faithfully until the sea claimed them. Their sacrifice must never be forgotten." Among the names, the 4,755 of Tamatsu Maru, the 2,665 of Teomaru, the 3,437 of Miyasan Maru, the 1,481 of Tatsuta Maru. These are but a fraction. For every named casualty, 3 more died unnamed, lost in ships that vanished without record. The final toll: 1,314 Japanese merchant ships sunk, over 5.3 million tons destroyed, 97,342 soldiers killed, tens of thousands of sailors, thousands of forced laborers and POWs, Japan's economy strangled, oil gone, food cut off, industry paralyzed, all by a force of 288 submarines and 36,000 men. And for those who faced them, the fear never faded. The silent death, the weapon they feared more than any other in the Pacific. Not the bomb, not the carrier, not the battleship, the submarine, because it was unseen, because it struck without warning, because it left no trace, because it meant death in darkness, trapped, helpless, while the enemy escaped unharmed. That is why, 60 years later, survivors still wake screaming in the night.